In 1993, in the ruins of a northern Israeli city called Tel Dan, a slab of black basalt was pulled from the rubble. It wasn't a temple. It wasn't a treasure. It was broken, shattered into fragments, and the letters carved into its face were faint, half-erased by time. But those few words would change the way we look at one of the most legendary figures in the Bible. Because right there, in ancient Aramaic, a king bragged about defeating the house of David. It was the first time the name David, as in King David of Israel, had ever appeared outside the Bible. Think about that. For centuries, some scholars believed David was just a myth like King Arthur with better press, a warrior poet imagined by ancient scribes to give Israel a golden past. But this stone, lying silent for nearly 3,000 years, whispered something different. But if David really existed, where's the rest of the evidence? To find out, we'll have to dig through ancient warfare, forgotten ruins, palace conspiracies, and the politics of archaeology itself. And what we'll uncover might not only reshape your view of the Bible, but also the way we define truth in history. But before we dive into that tangled mess of fact and faith, we need to go back to the bloody birth of kingship in ancient Israel. Because David didn't come from nowhere. He came from chaos. And what came just before him set the stage for everything that followed. Long before David picked up a harp or a sword, Israel wasn't a kingdom. It was a loose confederation of tribes. Think clan alliances, not organized nation-states. They shared some customs, worshipped a common god mostly, but lived in separate hilltop settlements. No kings, no taxes, no standing army. Just elders, judges, and tribal warlords. But those wild years were ending fast. Powerful neighbors, like the Philistines with their iron weapons, or the Canaanite city-states with their fortified walls, were pressing in. Israel's decentralized system wasn't cutting it anymore. The tribes wanted someone to rally behind, someone to unify them. Enter Saul, the first king, tall, handsome, charismatic, and tragically unstable. He started strong, defeated the Ammonites, fought off the Philistines. But his reign spiraled into paranoia. He turned on his own people. And then came David. But before David took the throne, he was just a shepherd boy with a sling. Or was he? We'll get to the Goliath story soon. But first, we have to ask a different question. Who really wrote David's story, and when? And that's where the plot thickens. When was David invented? Or was he? A huge debate among scholars isn't just whether David existed, but when the stories about him were written down. Because timing changes everything. If the book of Samuel was written during David's lifetime, it's a contemporary source. If it was written centuries later, it could be more fiction than fact. Most scholars agree the earliest parts of the Hebrew Bible took shape during the 7th or 6th century, BCE, well after David supposedly lived. That means the authors were writing about a distant past they couldn't witness. But here's the twist. That doesn't automatically mean it's all fake. Ancient oral traditions were strong. Think of the Iliad passed down by bards for centuries before it was written. David's story could have followed the same path. Still, that opens a door. What if David's image as a perfect king was polished over time? What if the Bible's David is a legend based on a real but very different man? That brings us to the elephant in the room, or rather the giant. The one with the slingshot. But that story might not mean what you think. Everyone knows the story of David, the young shepherd, faces Goliath, the towering Philistine warrior. With just a sling and a stone, he strikes him down. It's a tale of underdog triumph. It's iconic. But here's what most people don't know. The Bible actually has two different versions of this story. In one, David kills Goliath. In another, according to 2 Samuel chapter 21, verse 19, it says someone named Elhanan did it. Wait, what? Some scholars think David might have inherited someone else's heroic deed, or that multiple versions of the story existed, and they got merged. And that's not the only oddity. Goliath's height? In some versions, he's 9 feet tall. In others, just over 6. Ancient scribes might have exaggerated, or maybe we're dealing with myth layered over fact. But here is the key point. Whoever wrote the Goliath story wanted David to be more than just a king. They wanted him to be a symbol, a chosen one, a miracle in human form. That legend would be powerful and dangerous, because symbols can be used to justify almost anything. And in David's case, they would be used to justify bloodshed, betrayal, and a dynasty. But we're not there yet. First, we need to follow the archaeology. Now we come to the star of the show. The Tel Dan Stele was found in northern Israel, and it's one of the most explosive discoveries in biblical archaeology. Carved by a victorious Aramean king in the 9th century BCE, the inscription brags about killing a king from the house of David. That phrase, House of David, is everything. It means David wasn't just a name. He was a founder of a dynasty, a real political entity. This wasn't a random folk hero. He had descendants, power, and most importantly, a reputation. Some skeptics tried to argue it said something else, but the consensus among most scholars is clear. This is solid evidence that David was more than myth. Still, a name on a stone isn't a biography. To build a fuller picture, we need more clues. Clues buried under the dirt of ancient cities. And one of those cities might have been David's own capital. But finding it, that's a different kind of battle. Jerusalem, holy city, flashpoint of faith and politics, and allegedly David's capital. The Bible says David conquered the city from the Jebusites and made it the heart of his kingdom. But for a long time, archaeologists couldn't find anything in Jerusalem that matched that timeline. That's changing. Excavations near the city of David, the oldest part of Jerusalem, have revealed monumental structures, massive stone walls, administrative buildings, and a stepped stone structure that could have supported a palace. Some archaeologists, like Eilat Mazar, argue these ruins date back to the 10th century BC, David's supposed era. But here's the problem. Dating ancient ruins is tricky. Some say those walls are too old. Others say they're too young. And then there's the politics. Excavating Jerusalem isn't just science. It's tied to modern national identity. Every find becomes a battlefield of belief. But what if we step outside Jerusalem? What if we look to another city, one whose ruins are clearer, older, and just as telling? One city where David's shadow still lingers. About 20 miles southwest of Jerusalem, archaeologists uncovered a hilltop fortress called Khirbet Qeiyafa, overlooking the Elah Valley, the same region where David supposedly fought Goliath. This site dates back to the late 11th or early 10th century BCE, right in the sweet spot of David's alleged timeline. What makes this place special? For one, its fortified thick walls, gates, towers. This wasn't a village. It was a defensive outpost. And then there's the writing. Among the ruins, they found one of the oldest examples of Hebrew script ever discovered. It talks about social justice, protecting widows and orphans ideas that echo the biblical values of David's kingdom. Here's what makes that eerie. This isn't Jerusalem. It's not even in the center of Israel. But it looks like someone was already building organized infrastructure, writing laws, and defending borders. Could this have been one of David's frontier cities? A sign of a growing kingdom? Maybe. At the very least, it shows that someone was building something big at the time the Bible says David was alive. And the bigger the construction, the more power was needed to command it. But power always comes at a price. And David's story? It's soaked in that cost. If David was just a fictional hero, the Bible could have made him flawless. But it doesn't. In fact, it tells some brutally dark stories about him. Like the time he sent Uriah the Hittite to the front lines to die, just so he could take his wife, Bathsheba. or how his own sons rebelled against him. One even tried to seize the throne by force. And then there's the civil war that almost tore his kingdom apart. These aren't the stories you tell if you're making up a perfect king. These are messy, scandalous, human flaws, which might be a clue, because the rough edges, the betrayals, the moral failures, the family disasters sound more like memory than myth. And if some parts of David's story reflect real political drama, it raises a bigger question. How far did his kingdom actually stretch? Was David really a king of a united empire? Or was his throne smaller than the Bible makes it seem? To find out, we have to follow the money, or rather the lack of it. The Bible paints David as the ruler of a vast kingdom from Dan in the north to Beersheba in the south. But when archaeologists look at the remains from that era, they don't see signs of a sweeping empire. No massive palaces, no sprawling bureaucracies, no huge storehouses of wealth. What they see are small hilltop settlements, a handful of fortresses, modest construction. That's led some experts to argue that David may have been more like a regional chieftain than a mighty king. A strong man who ruled over a tribal coalition, not an empire. But here's the twist. In the ancient Near East, even small kings were called king. And power didn't always show up in gold or temples. It showed up in influence, in alliances, in legacy. Which brings us to one of the most important and most overlooked clues of all. The way David is remembered by those who came after him. Because even if the facts of his life are fuzzy, his reputation only grew. And the reason why? It wasn't about battles or borders. It was about promises. The Bible doesn't just tell David's story. It crowns it with a prophecy. In 2 Samuel 7, God tells David that his dynasty will last forever, that one of his descendants will rule eternally, that his house will never fall. That promise becomes the cornerstone of Jewish messianic hope. Centuries later, when the Babylonian exile shattered the kingdom of Judah, people still clung to David's name. When they dreamed of redemption, they didn't imagine a new Moses or Joshua. They dreamed of a new David. Even in the New Testament, Jesus is repeatedly called Son of David. That title carries political weight, spiritual power, and historical continuity. But here's the key. People don't hang messianic hopes on nobodies. If David had been a pure invention, his name wouldn't have survived exile, conquest, and rebuilding. So whether he ruled over 12 tribes or just 2, whether his palace was made of cedar or stone, his impact was real. And it would ripple out for centuries. But his story wasn't just about glory. Because long after his death, the shadow of David would fall over something darker. You might think archaeology is just digging in the dirt. But when it comes to King David, it's not just about shovels, it's about politics. Excavating in Jerusalem, interpreting the Tel Dan Stele, debating the timeline of the Bible, these things don't happen in a vacuum. They happen in a land where ancient history is tied to modern identity. For some, proving David existed validates their historical claim to the land. For others, questioning his story is a way to challenge national myths. This tension turns academic debates into front-page headlines. Scholars get labeled as believers or revisionists. Stones get turned into weapons, not just of archaeology, but of ideology. And yet, beneath all the noise, the evidence continues to build layer by layer, year by year. We may never find David's throne, or his harp, or his crown, but we have a name on a stone, a fortress in the hills, a dynasty remembered for thousands of years. And maybe that's enough, because history isn't about perfect proof. It's about the weight of echoes. So, did King David really exist? Not as a myth, not as a flawless hero, but as a man? The truth is, yes, almost certainly. Not in every detail the Bible describes, not with all the legends, but the evidence points toward a real leader, a real dynasty, a real impact. He may not have slain a giant, but he shaped a legacy that would outlive kingdoms. He may not have ruled an empire, but he stood at the crossroads of history and memory. And whether his palace was of stone or story, David endures, the shepherd, the outlaw, the king, a name carved in time and in stone,